Today, I'm joined by Aaron Sibarium. He is a writer for the Washington Free Beacon, a Yale graduate, and he was the opinion editor of the Yale Daily News back in the day when he was at this prestigious institution. And he was also an editor at the American Interest before joining the Free Beacon. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. I followed your work in tweet form for a while, and I've also read some of your really interesting essays. And I feel like we kind of have some convergent thoughts, and I was really excited to talk to you. I've also listened to some of your contributions on Clubhouse, one of the maybe 4 times I went there. So you're obviously someone who's clued into the present moment. So I'm excited to talk to you.
We were both in the reactionary feminism room. Were you there when it almost got derailed, but we were able to push it, right the ship?
I'm a sleepy pregnant woman. I always exit early, but I've heard that it was derailed. But what exactly derailed it? I can't remember.
Some very strange woke, self-described left anarchists started getting angry at the presence of white non-woke people on the stage, and the fact that we weren't talking enough about race and some other topics. And I mean, it was a little weird, but fortunately she was really the only one who was going there, so it didn't create any problems. But there were, for a good 20 minutes, we ended up just getting into an argument with her. But thankfully that resolved itself, and she just quit of her own volition. And that was nice, because she was accusing everyone of racism without making productive contributions, and I didn't like that.
Yeah, that's kind of been one of my pet peeves with Clubhouse. Like, the few times where I find a little bit of time to overlap and then get in there, I would say at least 50% of the time there's something like this, where someone's at least trying a little coup to break in and wokeify the room. And then there was also that Brett Weinstein situation where they essentially took over and then they kicked him off the stage, which I think is a strange functionality to have, because I think it was his room where he was a moderator before. It is a bit strange that people can just come in and, I don't know, commandeer.
It's like a real-time refutation of the marketplace of ideas meme. Which is kind of good, because I mean, look, like I'm all for open discourse, and there's an idealized form of the marketplace of ideas that I think it's good to aspire to, but people often, especially in kind of the IDW sort of centrist anti-PC liberal space, they want to argue, well, this stuff is all bad because it disrupts the marketplace of ideas. And no. The problem is that the marketplace of ideas is largely a myth, just as the pure free market is a myth. And to the extent that Clubhouse demonstrates in real time how mythological it is, I think that's probably one of the more positive contributions of the app to our discourse. Hopefully it disabuses people of the notion that we live in any kind of real marketplace of ideas, because we don't.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I think the Brett Weinstein recording is going to live in infamy as one of the highlights of this argument, or at least to disprove the argument about the marketplace of ideas. I don't know if everyone's getting the message though, because I know you've written about kind of the post-liberal moment and what arguments are going around. I've read an extremely great essay of yours on Adrian Vermeule and kind of his slant on the whole thing, and I want to talk about that as well. But it seems to me like this is kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm patting myself on the back here, but this is kind of the cutting edge of what people are thinking about right now. They're people like me who've game theoretically arrived at this point, just playing out all the scenarios and thinking about, observing, noticing continuously that, there are certain endpoints to certain ideas. Like you said, the free market isn't that free. The marketplace of ideas isn't that isn't that free either. And there are all sorts of constraints that are becoming very visible now. I don't know how I want to, phrase this, but kind of what's your, you've got your finger on the pulse. What's your feeling about where this is heading, or where is it? Where are we at this moment? Because I feel like a lot of people are thinking about this from different perspectives. Like you saw, you have the essay on Vermeule. He has his
Yeah.
Catholic integralism. There's, accelerationist. There's all sorts of visions about this, but I think I don't know, at least it seems like a very fruitful place to be thinking in.
Yeah, well, I mean, you basically just asked me to give my entire theory of modern Western politics.
Yes, that's
And
what we're here
I don't know if I have a
for.
coherent one worked out. So I'll sort of just make a maybe almost a meta observation, which is that, there have been plenty of times throughout history where there have been huge, often technologically mediated changes in society that create mass disruption. And I don't think that means that we should just lie down and take it, right? But I do think it should inspire a certain amount of humility, both about theorizing and especially about predicting where all this will go. Gun to my head, I would say in the short run, the quote unquote woke stuff is going to get a lot worse and keep going. And potentially, we will reach a point where it really, maybe we're already there, but we certainly, I think, will have at least a few years where the kind of consolidation of wokeism and all the institutions, amounts to a kind of totalizing regime that it's not terribly pleasant to live under. I don't really know how long that can last. And I think that people who are predicting, some kind of just permanent state or Orwellianism could be, but I'm not totally convinced that this stuff is stable. And I think, it's good to keep in mind that nothing lasts forever, both the good stuff, but also the bad stuff. And in general, I would say that the people who are kind of on our same wavelength, are often very correct in their critiques of the present moment. But then when they start trying to game out what will happen, or they start proposing their own positive alternatives, and frankly, I think Curtis Yarvin is a great example where the critiques are very good, but the alternative that's being sketched out, I'm not sure it's particularly plausible, especially in the United States. And I'm also not sure that any of us is terribly good at predicting the future. So, I would say prepare for stuff to get worse in the short run, but keep an open mind about the long run, and remember that, a lot can change in 20 years. So maybe, in 10 years, we reach the zenith of the quote unquote successor regime and it's really horrible. Then maybe it collapses, and maybe the collapse is terrible, and it's redolent of the Soviet Union collapsing into just kind of cronyism and softcore authoritarianism, or maybe it collapses into something that's actually a lot healthier. I really don't think we know, and I tend to be skeptical of people who claim that they know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and I also agree with the simple fact that it's easier to diagnose dysfunction than to propose systemic solutions, especially when it comes to essentially a global regime, because essentially the American empire in some way or another is present here as we speak in Romania, in my COVID bunker. It is permeated with the American empire. I mean, just listen to me. So it's everywhere, and it's just proposing. Oh, okay, so what should this look like? What will this look like? Is a pretty tall order, and but like you said, I think what I'm interested in is, and what's it is interesting to me to play out what might happen, to look at the direction, to look at where the vector is pointing, and to to maybe not be so surprised. But what will happen when this game theoretical scenario plays out, what's left after that, that's a big question. And there's so many factors in it. And one factor that you highlighted is technology. Do you think we would have reached this point in some way without the internet? To me, the internet seems to be like not just a catalyst, but just like the biggest, I don't know,
Yes.
TNT barrel, Acme brand.
Yeah, I really think that all of the kind of, either death of liberalism or post-liberal theorizing is largely worthless if it doesn't begin from the premise that a big portion of this stuff is technologically mediated. And just looking at history, right? Liberalism really did not come about until after the printing press, which is what created the kind of social conflicts that set in motion the religious conflict, and then the Peace of Westphalia, and all the other kind of institutions that were designed to channel and kind of mitigate diversity within Europe and kind of make pluralistic living possible. It was largely, the result, but both the problem was created by technology, but also the solution, arguably. With print medium, and then even with the televisual medium, it was possible for states to centralize information up to a point and kind of, limit social conflict by doing that. But also, print culture, I think was conducive in certain ways to kind of the myth of the marketplace of ideas. We can talk about why in a little bit. And the internet really just blows this up because it simultaneously makes possible a much greater degree of resistance and decentralization, but at the same time, it also makes possible an unprecedented degree of centralization and authoritarian control, right? China and sort of early 90s, like, Silicon Valley libertarianism, these are actually, I think, two sides of the same technological coin. They're both possibilities contained within the new technological dispensation. And which of those wins out, I don't know. I think the real challenge, right, is both extremes are fundamentally untenable. You can't have a kind of epistemic free-for-all, and you can't, or at least you shouldn't want to have, Chinese level totalizing, centralized control of information either. And really what we need to find is a way to live with technology, where it's not just pure epistemic free-for-all, but it's also, but we're not basically containing the epistemic anarchy by erecting a kind of epistemic tyranny, which I think is a solution that a lot of the quote-unquote disinformation experts, so to speak, want us to do. I don't think that that's a good idea. But to give them some credit, right? It really has never been possible to broadcast so many heretic and dissident views to so many people, in such a short amount of time with the internet. And that's obviously a problem for just social cohesion. And, people who just sort of tell you that there shouldn't be any guardrails, I think, are very naive. There have always been guardrails, and, the reason that we're getting some of this totalitarianism with Google, Facebook censorship is in part because, I think everyone kind of correctly senses that the total absence of guardrails is a recipe for suicide. The problem is that now they're going so far in the other direction that it's, this isn't just guardrails anymore. This is really, kind of coordinated control of every sort of epistemological avenue.
Yeah, and it does seem weird to me that a lot of people kind of on my side, which are the people that are being kind of crushed by the regime at the moment, their free speech is being curtailed, say, okay, the only thing we need to do is bring free speech back. We need to go back to the time when free speech was, in power, and that will solve our problem. But this is the position of the underdog, essentially. The people in power never need to argue for free speech because their position's already entrenched. You said something about, the marketplace of ideas being an illusion. I mean, I know why I think it is an illusion, but I'm curious why you think so. What's the argument there?
Well, we can get into my criticisms of Adrian Vermeule in a bit, but I will say I think his essay that I kind of responded to about this had a very clear statement of kind of the marketplace of ideas as a myth position. And the basic argument is, look, either you just tautologically define truth as whatever the marketplace of ideas produces, which is begging the question, and that's meaningless, or, right, you have some kind of external standard, external to the market standard of what truth is, and you'd have to look at over the long run, does the quote unquote free exchange of ideas tend to produce truth? And it's just not obvious that it does in any kind of systematic or reliable way. You can point to various mechanisms that distort the process of kind of collective social reason, such as just biases, heuristics. That's kind of the behavioral psych answer. But I don't even think you have to go there. You just have to say, look, like, the world is extremely complicated and so many smart people have been wrong. Just like look at it with your own two eyes. Does it seem like free speech and open discourse has always led to truth? And does it seem like when we've arrived at some important truth, be it technological or moral, that was primarily produced through just kind of the some spontaneous order of like different views vying against each other? There are discrete cases where that seems like the right model, but there's plenty of discrete cases where it just doesn't seem like the right model. And I'm not actually terribly socially conservative on a lot of things. I'm happy that our society is a lot more tolerant of gay people, for example, and I'm glad that not unexpected consequences notwithstanding, that we had something like the civil rights revolution that did end what really was like an oppressive regime against Black people. But like, you look at what happened in those cases, the liberals who want to go back and argue, oh, it's just the marketplace of ideas. I mean, maybe with gay marriage a little bit that works, but a lot of the building of tolerance, it was activists who actively did create disruption, and there was a lot of actual shaming and coercion involved in the construction of new non-racist social norms. Like, I'm glad that it's no longer acceptable to be overtly racist against people of color, but that wasn't like, it's not like we arrived at that conclusion through just spontaneously reasoning, through like Habermasian discourse, whatever. No, I mean, there were like activists who gained levers of power and used it to reshape law and to shame people who didn't cooperate. And like, I think that some of that was good, but it was coercive. It was not spontaneous order. And I think liberals who think otherwise are just kind of deluding themselves about the history. And, this is actually one place where, in many respects, I think the kind of woke critical theory left has a point, that a lot of quote unquote social and moral progress does come about not through the marketplace of ideas, but through coercion. The problem, of course, is that now the use of coercive cultural and state power is not necessarily being directed towards just ending racism. It's being directed towards like kind of completely reordering the regime around an insane set of kind of manufactured moral grievances.
Yeah. It does seem like it's kind of an incentive issue where there's extreme pressure on one end to kind of let this escalate, and there's extreme kind of pressure building on the other end to not intervene in it. And these, I think you mentioned this. What was it? I think I've picked it up, but maybe I don't even remember it exactly. This centrifugal. What was it? Yeah, I can't find it.
Was this in my Weimar essay?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It was essentially
like
the
this
idea.
sort of
Yeah, that too, kind of action begs reaction, and we are kind of in this
Yes.
spiral of reacting to each other. And I think technology layers on top of that, and you have very visible reactions that are disseminated instantly towards every partisan, and kind of everyone's forced into being a partisan. So I'm
Yes.
curious if you could expand on that a bit.
No, yeah, that's exactly it. I think you know, actually Trump and Trump derangement syndrome is a very good example of this, where Trump got elected in large part as a reaction to a kind of overreaching, elite, censorious, woke left that had just totally lost touch with reality and that was very contemptuous of half the country. Um, Trump's election did not pacify the woke left at all. It just drove them crazier. Um, as they got driven crazier, I think it drove the right even crazier in response. And I maybe a few of your anonymous listeners won't like this, but look, like the January 6th thing, it's not a good justification for anything the left wants to do. We shouldn't start some domestic war on terror or anything like that. But it wasn't good, and it was, I think, a symptomatic of the derangement that sort of this kind of iterative reaction spiral can produce. And then, at the same time, right, the response to January 6th, where now you have serious people talking about, you do have them talking about a domestic war on terror, is an example of how that iterative reactionary spiral, works on the left, where as the right gets crazier and crazier, the left just gets crazy, more and more paranoid about the right, and they both sides end up, to some extent, I think, confirming, the other stereotypes of them, and that's a very hard cycle to break out of. You can obviously play a game where you try to assign more moral culpability to one side or the other, depending on your priors. And there may be some kind of Platonic answer there as to who's more at fault. But at a certain point, like, I also think that discussion kind of misses the dyadic, kind of iterative nature of the dynamic. And ultimately, like, who cares whose fault it is? This is what's going on. Both sides are radicalizing each other. And yes, I'm probably on balance more worried about what the radical left will do, but you really can't understand their actions, kind of outside of the context of what they're reacting to, which is a more sort of, I think, radical right, and like, just sociologically, this is what's going on. What you do about it is a separate question, but if the diagnosis is wrong, the prescription is probably going to be wrong. And I really think that the diagnosis needs to be that both sides are driving each other crazy and, drifting further and further away from sanity.
Yeah, and I think the one of the key ingredients here is just the monetization strategy of almost every form of technology is to
Mm-hmm.
feed you entertainment, and there's nothing more entertaining than a kind of simmering religious war that's happening between your side and the other side that you,
Like,
yeah.
and a good example of that would be, people like Milo Yiannopoulos, right? I guess before he kind of fell from grace, but what was his business model, right? It was triggering the left and capitalizing, literally, making money on the reaction. He had no actual incentive to fight wokeness at all. I mean, if this stuff disappeared, he'd be out of business. And by the same token, right, a lot of the professional kind of activist class and the professional anti-disinformation class, I mean, these people have no incentive for the crazy stuff on the right to actually go away, and to actually maybe bring some of the real, out there QAnon types back to sanity. Because if they succeeded, they'd be out of business. They'd have no justification or mandate for their existence. So, like, of course, they're going to keep manufacturing these outrages. And of course, they're going to keep trying to drive the right insane and get the right to do insane things because that's what justifies their own power and their own existence. Yeah, no, it's the financial side of this is a real problem. Both sides have their kind of internal stakeholders who absolutely have no incentive to, um, you know, genuinely kind of pacify the other side.
Yeah, and also it's not just, you know, individual pundits. Like, this is the core business model of the internet. It's feeding, you know,
Yes.
you with outrage or with whatever keeps you on. And, you know, lizard brain knows what it wants. It wants, you know, hyper palatable food. It wants, you know, I don't know, boobs or whatever, and it wants complete tribal rage. And the internet is better than anyone at providing, you know, all of these.
Oh
And
yeah. Well,
yeah,
and of course, then you have sort of legacy media institutions who are perhaps the biggest offenders of this. And so much of what the New York Times publishes is just, it's feeding, it's simultaneously feeding their woke subscriber base, and it's also, I think, clickbait to get conservatives angry, to just create more controversies, right? Like that's all they're doing. So much of what these publications produce now is really just outrage porn. That's all it is.
yeah. I wonder kind of, because I feel like maybe one of the possible alternatives to everything that's going on in this space, you know, this kind of this escalation that everyone's in, and everyone's really has their haunches up, and, oh, you know, collapse is imminent, and it would just be, you know, kind of a return to localism in some way, in kind of return to maybe even in a way online localism, to kind of just descale things and to uncouple yourself from at least from the main pipeline of, you know, crazy slop that's just coming at you
Yeah.
24/7. I think that would, at least, and I know a lot of people kind of who are educated enough to know that this is entertainment rather than politics, do that. You know, they uncouple consciously, and they do this systematically. They're like homesteading, and they're buying, you know, property in Vermont and stuff like that. But I feel like, you know, this is now kind of what the some elites are doing, because they know this is not good for them. But I'm curious if this could, I don't know, if you see that this might be like a trend or something that people move into, because it's deranging to be.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that the kind of the deranging quality of online discourse does probably make some sort of localism, even a kind of deterritorialized online localism, more attractive. The problem, though, is that deterritorialized online localism is fundamentally a different kind of localism, and, you know, online subgroups are a different kind of community than, you know, a physical geographic locality. And a lot of our, not just our political system, but our kind of mimetic and ideological technology for making sense of the world, you know, is inherited from a time in which geographic and spatial boundaries were more important to defining and bounding communities than they are now with the internet. So yes, like, I think that there is a kind of move towards what you might call online localism, where people try to find their, you know, little online niches, and find meaning that way. But there's, I think, only so much that an online space can do. There, you know, there is a difference between physical interaction and the internet. But B, uh, you know, we had kind of a system for, like, letting localities flourish independently of each other and kind of creating space for them and supporting them. We had sort of a system that was supposed to do that, but we don't really have a system that's set up to do that online. Not a political or technological system, and not even really, I think, ideological or philosophical system. So, you know, that doesn't mean that this won't work or won't happen. I just think we should be honest. Let's go back to what I said earlier, that you know, people really have no theory of how sort of online localism is supposed to work, and I don't think that we really can say with any confidence just how it will work or what kinds of institutions will need to be created in order for it to work. This is actually, I don't really understand the whole kind of crypto decentralized capitalism thing that folks like Pathologies, Srinivas and others talk about. I don't understand it super well. I think it's very interesting, but to the extent I understand it, this seems to be the main problem I see with it, that like, you know, the state and kind of institutionalized political power all assumes that the boundaries of community are spatial to some extent, and they're basically imagining a world in which just the space, space has nothing to do with community and communal boundaries, and that really entails like a huge ideological and institutional shift that I don't really think that they've fully thought out, or if they have, I just haven't really heard like a
Yeah.
detailed response to how all this is supposed, like, all this is supposed to migrate into cyberspace and work in cyberspace. It may be doable. I think it's very hard to predict how it will work, and it will be a kind of rough and experimental process.
Yeah, yeah. I've kind of played around with these kind of online localism ideas as well, and what Balaji was talking about. It does seem to me like a lot of this musing about the future of online communities is done by people who are kind of very high intellect, high decoupling, maybe a touch of autism in the mix as well. And I have very hard time seeing how it scales. I mean, very hard time imagining how it
Yeah,
works in principle, because I think, a
me
lot of
too.
these guys can imagine that it works, because they can imagine many things working, and, everything's kind of got a little bit of a mechanistic vibe when you talk to people in tech. The napkin calculation for this whole system might be airtight, but once you translate it into the real world and you kind of bring human being, these great apes into the
Right.
combination, I feel like the level of abstraction that this stuff is handled at is just it's not necessarily representative. And I feel like that's kind of one of my main gripes with the kind of libertarian liberalism as well. The idea that
Yeah.
there is one level of abstraction. It is the individual. You deal with the individual through property rights. We just all agree to not hurt each other, and bada bing, bada boom, that's society, and whatever floats your boat. That's just absolutely has nothing to do with how human creatures actually work in
Right.
the world. I don't know. That's my main gripe. Obviously, I have a lot of people who are libertarians who like my content and do comment lots of times on my tweets, and I sometimes talk about this stuff with them, but most of the time I'm just I'm the difference in
Yeah.
just worldview between me. I used to be a libertarian, but now I don't know. I've lived, guys. It's life
Right.
does it to you. I don't know
I
what's
mean,
your stance on it.
I think, yeah, so I tend to share that kind of Burkean critique, and I would say go further and say, some of the folks like Yarvin who have this sort of almost like, neo monarchism, it's itself based in a very kind of rationalizing modernist abstraction that I think does ignore a lot of the real life just complexities of lived experience, and that's where a lot of my skepticism of it comes from. I'm skeptical of what maybe Curtis wants to do for the same reasons I'm skeptical of what a lot of libertarians want to do, or even some centrist liberals for that matter. On the other hand, to be charitable, right? In times where old paradigms are breaking down, no one kind of system-based thinker is going to probably succeed in predicting everything that happens and in redesigning like the entire world order. And I'm sure that if you pressed him, even someone like Balaji, I'm sure would concede that he doesn't have all the answers. He's not going to be right about everything, but you do need those kinds of people to put out kind of ideas and totalizing systems, not because any one of them is going to be right, and not because the marketplace of ideas guarantees that the best one will win out, but just because the old paradigm clearly is breaking down under the influence of technology. So we're going to get to a new paradigm somehow, and it's not just that we need people who are thinking in this way, it's that thinking in this way is almost just an essential constitutive part of moving from one paradigm to the other. So it's probably healthy to some extent that all these kind of weird zany ideas are out there now. I'm without arguing that the best of each one will somehow migrate to the top and create some like perfect utopia. I do think that probably a couple of them will contain real insights that do end up serving as important planks in whatever new order new equilibrium we arrive at. And so look, like even if I don't agree with them, like I like people like Curtis and I like people like Balaji because I do think that they're performing an important function in this kind of interstitial space we find ourselves at.
And I feel like there's quite a lot of kind of convergence between the two of them in a way, because they're both libertarians at heart. Curtis is a bit more, I guess he's a bit more weathered in a way by history, at least his perspective on history. He's a bit less. I don't know, what was it, like mobbed by reality or something, but he's still a libertarian. I think his idea, and probably Balaji's idea in a way, would be to have some form of competitive city states. I mean, I'm making this up, I'm just kind of giving you my interpretation, but this is kind of the feeling I'm getting, that are led by a Lee Kuan Yew type CEO person, and then you don't necessarily have tyranny because you have exit on these city states. Obviously, this is all very high level, but I feel like this, of all the endpoints of impending collapse, this might be one of the better ones, in a way, like these little Byzantiums.
One thing that's interesting to note about that argument, though, is there's an important qualifier there. You won't have tyranny because there's exit. But that only really works if the exit rights come with entry rights, because otherwise, if you exit and then you're just out of any state, like, well, you can't really exit because then you're stateless, and that's terrible. So in order for that to really work and be meaningful in practice, you would need, I think, like the world to be, if not open borders, then I mean, there'd have to be the possibility for people to meaningfully choose between alternatives. And so it would, in order for that normative vision to be remotely plausible or attractive, I think you would need a world that had, if not open borders, then at the very least pretty porous ones. And look, I mean, there might be a way to make that work, but it is interesting that many of the people who seem attracted to that kind of vision are often deeply skeptical of immigration. And I mean, look, I'm skeptical to an extent of immigration. I don't think that open borders is a good idea, or at least I don't think we can have tons of new arrivals come in without it creating real social conflicts. But like, if your plan for the world is, just like competitive city states where people can choose between, a kind of, free market of city states, I don't really understand how that's supposed to work without, basically free movement of labor, throughout the world.
Yeah, I think there's these being libertarians mostly. They kind of default on the idea that if you don't have a welfare state or something, the incentives for
Yeah,
overtures are going to be just less of an incentive to
sure,
there's less of a
sure.
pressure to offer all this stuff. Libertarianism works much better, even the napkin calculation, if you just completely dismantle any sort of
Right.
redistribution. But
Of course, you know, that puts a huge constraint on the ability, right, of states to actually try out different things. And so it kind of, it's almost a bit, maybe not a contradiction, but a tension within the view, because if if in order for this whole scheme to work, all states would in practice have to basically, like, you don't want mass influx of immigrants to like destabilize the city state. Like, okay, so you can't really do, you either have to have borders, which kind of undermines the free entry exit premise, or you'd have to maybe have open borders, but like, get rid of the welfare state, so that, there aren't these huge incentives. Except if you get rid of the welfare state, like, that's a huge, suddenly that's a huge constraint on what all the states in the system can do. And so then it's not really like a true free market of city states, because that, suddenly one of the things that they could do to attract people is just kind of off the table. So like, again, like when you try to game all this out, um it's hard to really imagine a stable equilibrium where, like, you can either have a world where there's, market of city states, but they all kind of come to resemble each other, and there's no welfare state. It seems like that might have some bad knock-on effects. Or, they do have a welfare state, but they, in order to maintain it, have to have closed borders, in which case, or severe border controls that kind of undermine the whole premise of free entry exit that's supposed to make this a, you know a
yeah,
normatively legitimate system, and
this
one.
is yeah, starting to to sound more like your typical Westphalian states, but with like a CEO. And I guess they're probably monarchies if we really think about it.
Yeah,
So this is probably just winding the clock back maybe a nice 200 years, but with flying cars, or I don't know exactly what will be in
right.
the utopia.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, we don't need to keep going down the rabbit hole of the game theory. I just think it's worth pointing out, right, that these schemes have kind of obvious problems, not necessarily more obvious than other alternatives, but just like, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that something like this, would happen without a ton of kind of contradictions that needed to be worked through and solved.
Yeah, I feel like this probably versions of this probably will happen, but the idea that this is going to be the new consensus of how to organize society, and every unit of humanity is going to be organized this way, I think that's probably impossible. I can't imagine like some high class Byzantiums popping up in different ways, but
Right.
they would probably have some form of border control, or absolutely no welfare state, and it's like a bit of a high tech state of nature, in which 160 IQ tech
Right.
behemoths compete at pinochle or whatever they do in the city state. So yeah, it is interesting to see. I mean, hope I'll be alive to see it. But it's an interesting time to be alive. At least things are happening apace. At least if you're interested in the in what's going on in the world.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I'm curious if you've read a book, because I mean, reading your Weimar essay reminded me of this book called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. Have
Not
you?
read it.
It's I think it's an interesting book. It's like the subtitle is Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements, and it's looking at what conditions and what types of people um, congregate to fuel these mass movements. And this could be anything from, you know, Antifa on the one hand, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, super, you know, extreme right wing, you know, militias on the other. And I think it's interesting that he observes that, you know, there are some preconditions that typically create mass movements. So are people, you know, feeling resentful, either falling from grace, or they you know, their parents had a certain social status, now they have a different social status. You know, they can't get ahead in life. But it's also a type of personality that typically tends to be attracted to these things. You know, typically people who have
Yes.
a narcissistic streak, or people who are very invested in their self perception. And then the mass movement gives them the opportunity to renounce the self, to just kind of, you know, stick onto this higher identity, and it's a relief for them. So I feel
Yeah.
like, you know, this is kind of something that's a type of personality that is almost perfectly spawned by the internet. You know, it's like the burden of
Yes.
the self is very high nowadays. You know, who are you, identity, all this stuff. You know, you hear about this every day. And you know, if you become part of the movement, then you don't even have to necessarily worry about that much. You know, your identity is, I don't know, BLM or whatever, whatever
Right.
flavor of the month.
Or what this reminds me of is perhaps your identity can become just being a public health expert. And in order for that to be an identity, there has to be a certain homogeneity of values and premises that all public health experts adopt for it to really be, you know, to appear both as sort of credentialed expertise, but also to have this kind of functional role as an identity. And I do wonder if that explains some of the kind of homogenization of public health advice as the course of this pandemic has worn on, and this weird desire of some public health officials to seemingly prolong the pandemic by scaremongering about variants and vaccine and, you know, vaccine resistance and things like that. I mean, I think you could, once you start seeing the world in this way, it's a very powerful framework, and I think you start to see that a lot of fields of quote unquote expertise really are at root kind of more just like almost identitarian communities, and ways of sort of reducing the burden of identity in the digital age, and ways of feeling like you're part of, you know, the priesthood of public health, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a very timely example. And it's interesting to me how it took a little bit of time to get to the canonical interpretation of the virus that every health expert adhered to, because there was a little bit of instability at the beginning, because everyone was looking around to see, hey, what's what side of this are we on? And I think, you know, in the beginning it was, you know, the very online right wingers were all about masks and prepping and buying toilet paper.
Right.
But then it flipped, and then now, you know, obviously the right wingers want to murder babies, and I don't know, be extremely, you know, cavalier about this deadly virus. Yeah, it is. I think
Right.
that's probably one of the bigger things against the marketplace of ideas. How liberalizing information and making it super competitive and super status related in this, you know, competitive field, essentially the internet, and, you know, the open marketplace of ideas, how much that ties into identity, and how
Right.
much that, you know, that nukes the concept of, oh, we're just
Right.
throwing around ideas here. No, you're battling identities. These are fucking Pokemon,
Right.
you know.
Well, that's actually, I think that's another way of answering the question you asked earlier about what's the problem with the marketplace of ideas. Well, think about what the mechanism in a normal market is. It's the price mechanism in the kind of canonical Hayekian interpretation of markets. It's the price mechanism that communicates value, right, and information. But the problem is that sort of prices in the digital age, you know, sort of kind of the things that communicate the value, so to speak, of ideas are likes and retweets, and they're things that tend to not be correlated with truth. They're not really like doxastic indicators They're more social indicators of value. And so, you know, when the marketplace of ideas is online, the quote unquote price mechanism, there is a price mechanism. It is communicating information. It is kind of leading to, you know, equilibria, but the information it's communicating isn't about truth. It's about the social value of ideas, and the equilibria that you're arriving at are not epistemic equilibria necessarily, or they're not epistemic equilibria that corresponds to the truth. They're sort of epistemic equilibria that correspond to a particular ideological narrative or social cause, right? And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, you know, like you said, this push for people to be, you know, institute fact checking and, you know, wage war on misinformation. But yeah, that's kind of the, you know, the Achilles heel for all of this, because, you know, you're essentially just giving it a social rating. Like, you know, like I think when Kellyanne Conway said that there are alternative facts, she was really, you know, she you know, it sounded a bit dubious, but yeah, it's that's kind of how it works, and that's kind of how the internet is. And the reality is that, you know, any event that happens, depending on, you know, which statistic you want to pull out of it, you know, there are, you know, alternative facts. Things are complex the way they happen in real life, and if you see, you know, if you see a different part of the elephant, then yeah, that's an alternative fact. And yeah, I don't know, what's your relationship, because you've been in the press now. You're a relatively recent graduate, but you've been in college, you've been in the papers. What's your personal relationship to facts?
Personal relationship to facts, huh? That's a good question. I mean, facts exist, and there is a standpoint neutral, objective, independent reality that I think is in principle knowable, or at least something that is in principle partly knowable through the right epistemic mechanisms. You know, I'm not a hardcore postmodernist. I don't think that all truth, that it's all social constructs all the way down, right? That said, I do think that actually a certain kind of postmodernist sensibility is very, very useful for analyzing power and what's going on, and sort of the construction of, not the construction of maybe literal truth, but like the construction of what we all quote unquote agree is true. Yeah, like I think a lot of things that are accepted as quote unquote facts are not really factual, but it doesn't matter because everyone agrees to treat them as facts. I guess one example that might get me canceled, but I'll say it anyway, is that the idea that there's an epidemic of, you know, shootings of unarmed black men is by the police is just, I mean, there's no real statistical evidence for it. I mean, there is evidence that the police sometimes shoot people too quickly, and that, you know, police aren't always well trained, and there are black and white people who get unjustly shot by the police, and that's obviously bad. But the idea that, and there is evidence that, you know, cops are biased against African Americans in certain ways, like more traffic stops, things that can't totally be explained by differences in crime rates. There's some kernel of truth there, but like the broader narrative that, you know, cops will just like pull their guns and, you know, routinely like execute, you know, unarmed black men on the street, like, you know, but not do this for other races. It's just not true. And yet, simply stating clearly that it's not true and being upfront about that is to cancel yourself. And there's an entire media apparatus that says, no, it is true, and if you disagree, you're evil, right? So I would say that, look, people like Herbert Marcuse and Foucault and even Chomsky and thinkers like that, their ideas are very useful for analyzing the kind of, you know, social construction of truth. It's just that if you apply that analysis correctly, in my view, you will come to see that a lot of the socially accepted truths are not right-wing ones, they're more left-wing ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm struck by how much the needle was moved in this direction by the simple fact that now we have streaming video, and
Yes.
you have little pieces of information that you can watch things 1,000 times. And also the fact that now police I think, are they obligated to have body cams, or they want to have body cams? Depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I think, this has been what's been going on since, I guess, Rodney King. But now you can have an event like this, every week, every month, and it does look terrible. Like, these are instances of violence. They're selective instances of violence, like, the Tony Timpa thing didn't get that much airtime, though that one was also quite a vicious situation of in a way, murder by cop. So there are, these are the little tidbits, and the lizard brain is not prepared to deal with that stuff. So
well, and it goes, I mean, look, it does happen on all sides. Like it's very possible. I mean, I do think that that cancel culture, for example, is a real thing, and that there kind of is a sort of increasingly a kind of soft despotism, in all our institutions. But look, I mean, the reality is that the most insane things on both sides are like now kind of selected for by the internet, and people see them. And so, yes, like you can just pull out, out of context kind of scenes of Black men getting shot and make it seem like this is a ubiquitous social problem when that's not really true. You can also, I think, point to the craziest, abuses of, say, like the HR bureaucracy, and paint a narrative in which, white people are being like systematically fired from their jobs for saying that, that, like, I don't know, for saying that there are only two genders or something like that. And I mean, how, like, that does happen, and it's a problem. I think it's probably more prevalent in some ways, and more of a problem than the police thing. But like, how often does it really happen? What's your actual risk of being fired for having the wrong opinion? I mean, I think it's increased, and that does create a kind of deterrent effect where people don't want to speak their mind, because even a small chance of being fired you don't want to take. But like, I mean, look, let's be honest. I don't think that I think that there are like millions and millions of people go about their lives every day saying their opinions, or not getting canceled, and generally being fine. Like, and I do think it's worth keeping in mind that there is kind of this a shrinking but still very much existent space of normality when you're not very online. And I do think the internet tends to distort people's perceptions of that.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. It's interesting to me because you're a recent graduate of the Ivy system, and I'm curious what your take is on what's going on, because a lot of people say, okay, this has been spawned by the universities, and the worst offenders, obviously the Ivy Leagues, the most elite of the elite institutions.
They're horrible.
So is that your take? Horrible? Was it worth the money?
I mean, it's complicated. So I was there. I was a sophomore in 2015, which was when the kind of famous Halloween cultural appropriation controversy happened. And I was actually the
Christakis affair, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was the opinion editor of the school paper during Christakis Gate. And so I had to field all the opinion columns, bemoaning Yale's alleged institutional racism and all that. And one, it's a good experience because it made me see up close just how deranged this stuff is. And also, frankly, both how just dumb a lot of these arguments are, and how a lot of people making these arguments genuinely can't think in a rational, logical way on one hand, and on the other hand, how many smart people who I know could think in a rational, logical way and could understand why the arguments were dumb and did deep down, I think, understand it, just how easy it is to stay silent and kind of allow the woke minority to kind of steamroll over everybody. In terms of what this stuff did to, like, how much Ivy League or just universities are to blame, obviously they shoulder some of the blame. I do think it's a bit simplistic to say that you just, universities spawn these ideas and the ideas migrated into the culture, and that the rest is history. That's part of the story, and it's not at all surprising to me that as people graduate Yale and then go to the New York Times comes to resemble Yale and in its sort of cultural sensibilities. That's unsurprising. On the other hand, Ray, you do have to ask why these ideas gained a foothold in the university in the first place, and why they expanded so rapidly, when they did. I think part of it is the internet. That's a powerful disseminating force, but I also think that it's deeper than that. For one thing, a lot of the racial categories that kind of are at play in kind of the woke eschatology, a lot of them were sort of invented by like the federal government and the civil rights bureaucracy, like AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. There's no reason that those things should go together, and the reason they do is literally that the Office of Management and Budget, when it was like administering some kind of, I think, either affirmative action program or minority set aside program, just kind of like made this up in order to just as a matter of administrative convenience, and then the meme kind of propagated, and now it's we think of these discrete, totally different groups of people as part of one like protected class. So that's one influence, and then I would say there's a couple others. One, I think, is that look, there are genuine disparities and inequalities that I think are experienced as unjust and painful, and that creates emotional and kind of moral energy behind ideologies that promise to eliminate or correct the disparities. And frankly, look, a lot of the complaints about disparate impact and the lack of minority representation in elite institutions are kind of unhinged and overblown. But the complaint about, say, the black-white wealth gap, that's actually a real thing, right? I mean, it is kind of insane how little wealth some people have and how wealth inequality tends to kind of sometimes track racial divisions. I mean, I think it probably is substantively unjust, but even if it's not, it's clearly not good for the republic. It's not stable. I mean, there's the whole history of Republican thought has emphasized that excessive concentrations of wealth and excessive wealth inequalities are really bad for social stability, and thus, Machiavelli, right, and others like encourage, republics to make sure that they don't let it get that point. So I do think that wealth inequality plays a role and makes some of this stuff feel, gives it a certain kind of moral mandate it wouldn't otherwise have. And certainly the fact that there is a history of racial oppression in the United States just amplifies all of that. And then the last thing, and this is a kind of speculative argument that I'm working on, and I haven't written it up yet, much to my shame, but it will be written one day. It's in the works. I think once we made it not just the state's job, but also the job of private corporate bureaucracies to promote social justice, we created a pressure to kind of redefine social justice in terms that would be legible and measurable to bureaucracy, right? If you're familiar with James C. Scott's argument and seeing like a state, it's that like states have to come up with like ways of quantifying and seeing their population, and that necessarily involves abstracting away from the kind of messy thicket of interpersonal relations and thinking of citizens in more almost statistical terms. And I think there's a kind of analogous process going on when it comes to, say, racial justice, where something like intent mattering, right? Intent is a hard thing to determine, right? Claims about intent are subjective and unfalsifiable. And so it's very hard to have a system like a civil rights or kind of anti-discrimination system that just tries to police kind of bad, invidious intent and determine whether there was invidious intent, because bureaucracy just inherently really can't do that. But what they can do is they can measure racial disparities. What they can do is they can measure complaints of microaggressions, regardless of intent, right? And so I think a lot of what wokeness is sort of an emergent property of a bureaucratized system of social justice, because it's really a way of justifying bureaucratic imperatives. Like, you can't solve these problems through a bureaucracy unless you conceptualize the problems in terms bureaucracy can understand. And disparate impact is just a much easier thing for a bureaucracy to understand and track than actual, say, intent to discriminate or something like that. And so I think that's why we've seen a movement away in the culture from believing that intent matters, right? To just a culture where it's all about outcomes, and it's all about things that can be quantified. Really, that's a lot of what wokeism is. And it's not to say that that's the only or even the primary source of it, but I do think that that's an important part of the story that hasn't really been explored and told. I don't really know what the solution is, because we're not going to go back to a world in which bureaucracies are going to take social justice to be a mandate and an imperative. We're just not going to undo that, both, I think, because politically it's impossible, and frankly, because morally, in a world where there are inequalities and there are problems and there is a history of, racial injustice, this is just what we're stuck with, a kind of, bureaucratized way of handling social justice. But once you bureaucratize social justice, it, I think, creates systemic pressures that lead to these pathologies. And I don't really know what the answer is. A good first step might be to have smarter, more competent bureaucrats who are capable of being a little more nuanced. I think the dumber the bureaucrats are, the greater the pressure is for them to simplify the problem. But that's not a perfect solution. And yeah, I think that there is a lot of truth in Caldwell's etiology of wokeism, tracing it back to the civil rights movement. But I also don't really know what the alternative would be. And frankly, I don't think he has an alternative. And we're not going to dismantle the civil rights state. Frankly, I don't think we should. And I don't really think that anyone proposing we should has thought for 2 minutes how that's going to work and just how we're going to move forward. So we have that bureaucracy. We have all the mini HR departments it spawned. They've kind of been captured by this ideology. There are selective pressures that make it very hard for them to resist being captured by this ideology. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, and there's
some things we can do about it, but not that many.
Yeah, and there's essentially once this, because I really like this argument, the kind of seeing like a state argument. I think it applies to a few things, but this one, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head with that one. And I think once this train is in motion, there are feedback mechanisms, little loops that kind of expand this even further. So, it's if your imperative as a, either an HR department, which is essentially kind of a little state apparatus within a company, or the state itself, is to address inequality, you're going to be looking essentially kind of p-hacking inequality in any sort of way. And like you said, there's these aggregate categories, like for example, Black, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, things like that, all these kind of aggregates. But it's interesting that if you were to actually, break down a lot of these categories by more granular heritage, you'd see that there's quite different, even within sub ethnicities. Like, there are certain Nigerian tribes that are doing extremely well, or like doing extremely well in Silicon Valley or things like that. So the blindness to this, or the kind of the selective blindness to certain perspectives like this, I think is part and parcel of the construction and the longevity of these institutions. They have an incentive to show that whatever they're doing is not working, because either the HR department in the company, you're not going to get rid of the HR department. It's there to make spreadsheets, and it's there to show stats. So it's not correlated to any sort of productivity. No one's getting fired in these places.
Well, yeah. So that's true, but it's important to also keep in mind that even though that's true, the HR department doesn't believe it's true, and the corporations don't necessarily believe it either, right? They actually think, you hear all this rhetoric about how diversity actually helps the bottom line. Does it? I mean, maybe in certain cases, but probably in most, this is just like made up. But because it's like a socially constructed standard of efficiency, it's kind of decoupled from any reality or objective metric of like efficiency or performance.
It's become reality.
Exactly. This is the kind of postmodernism reasserting itself.
Yeah, if you're caught out not doing enough diversity, then it might be really bad for the bottom line.
It's actually, this is a good example. There's something, it's called a double hermeneutic effect in philosophy and social theory, where like the way you interpret the world in turn actually shapes the world, which in turn kind of confirms the interpretation, right? So if you say that like this is just, diversity is important for efficiency, like, and then everyone starts to believe that, then if you don't have a diverse company, putting aside even the possible civil rights lawsuits, people will believe that you're not efficient or you're not good, and then they won't shop there, and it will hurt your bottom line. So the very act of claiming that efficiency, that diversity leads to efficiency, is in some sense a self-fulfilling prophecy once enough people make the claim and believe it. Again, I would just emphasize, like, I think this is bad and a problem. I also don't think it's, civilization ending or the end of the world. Like, efficiency isn't the be all end all. And there have always been a lot of stupid fads, before kind of wokeism, where businesses thought something was like efficient and they didn't really have any evidence. And through this sort of process of like, mimetic, like homogenization and isomorphism, they all just sort of like came to, like business culture just, passes through fads, and like that's just how it works. And that hasn't and probably won't destroy American capitalism. One thing I do get really annoyed with is people who claim that because BLM is technically a Marxist group, that like BLM and wokeism is like a Trojan horse for socialism. I just really don't see it. It's institutionalized in huge companies that have a very strong incentive to not embrace socialism. Bernie lost handle. The idea that we're going to turn into a communist country actually with like economic central planning because of wokeism, no, that's not what's going to happen. We'll have lots of mini inefficiencies as we try to promote diversity and become ever more obsessed with like managing microaggressions and managing what are really micro disparities within companies. That will have costs. The biggest costs are probably that they just make everyone obsessed with race and make everyone think in a kind of unhealthy racialist way about the world, that phrase the social fabric. But like the idea that there's some straightforward pathway from this to command and control Soviet Union poverty, no, that's just not true. And people like James Lindsay should not say that it is or imply it, because they're wrong.
I think it's an interesting perspective because they both deal in class consciousness, and I feel like that's an easy association to make. Kind of the idea of group rights, but this is not the place where group rights were invented. Group rights were a thing, for a very long time and in many different ways. But I'm curious how much you think that this has become salient, because in a way this is all there is. So your relationship to the market seems to be the only place left to interact. You've got kind of the breakdown of local communities, of religious systems of faith outside of politics and the internet, and how well you perform in terms of how much money you can make, or how many consumption opportunities you're able to generate, or how much status you can milk from the system with your brain cells, has become really, really important. So in a way, that kind of the meritocracy has kind of become very like an iron force, because there's not many other competing forces with it, for a lot of people. So it seems like, okay, we need to somehow integrate everyone into the meritocracy, which is just an impossible task. Some people will be better suited at becoming Facebook executives than others, and if that's the only ladder that you have, then obviously you're going to have social conflict, because there's no alternative safety nets for status.
I think that's right. And I would add, though, that that I think is another. People think of meritocracy and kind of wokeism as opposed, but there was a good essay in Tablet recently that argued that, in fact, no, they're two sides of the same coin, because what wokeism does is it manufactures these narratives of oppression that then people can claim to have overcome, thereby signaling their merit and signaling that they deserve a spot at the top of the meritocracy, and thus credentializing themselves. So when you create this competitive rat race, it produces pressures to find new ways of demonstrating your merit, especially if the established ways, maybe you're not going to be the best test taker, right? You find another way of showing your talent and your merit outside of the SAT. So in practice, I don't actually think that meritocracy is a very stable form. Like pure meritocracy hasn't and doesn't really exist in the United States. I guess maybe it can exist in some Asian countries or some discrete bureaucracies in Asian countries, but like it's hard to make work. I think it's probably not a coincidence that the country we most associate with meritocracy today is China, which is A, fairly ethnically homogenous, and B, extremely like totalitarian and coercive, and just keeps ethnic minorities down by like putting them in camps and beating them with electric rods, right? Like I think true pure meritocracy is unstable. So if you want a meritocratic form of government and a meritocratic selection mechanism, to the extent China has that, you kind of have to either make compromises like affirmative action or things to kind of take the edge off the most glaring kind of inequalities and exclusions of the meritocracy, or you just have to tell people, we're doing it this way, and if you don't like it, we'll shoot you. And I would prefer, frankly, the former to the latter, right? Like I'd rather the meritocracy be a bit diluted about what it is and make all these compromises and not be fully meritocratic. I'd rather that than us keep pure meritocracy and solve the inevitable social conflicts it creates, through the barrel of a gun, which I think is kind of the only alternative. So, and of course, then the third alternative is to just not have meritocracy. But in the modern world, like, what is, how do you actually do that? So yeah, there's no great answer here.
Yeah, it's a tough question, because a lot of times when people talk about unequal representation and where are the women in Fortune 500, companies, they look at it almost like it's, like you're acceding to royalty. Like, once you just get into the boardroom, you can kick your feet up and then, you're set. These are like grinding places.
Mm-hmm.
The war of all against all is quite active at the top. Places of intrigue, that compete with the Middle Ages, and this whole idea that, especially, I mean, from my perspective as a woman, I've been kind of in the rat race, and I've tried to, did my fair share of clawing, and it's not all it's cracked up to be. And it's sincerely, this is the only thing that is presented as worthy in our culture for whoever, it's, male, female, wherever you're from. You're supposed to be, either raking it in or making it big somewhere. And I don't know, I feel like, the mythologies of finding value somewhere else have kind of really fallen away. Like, you need to really kind of go through it to see the emptiness of it, to come out on the other side and, okay,
Yeah.
make money work somehow, but not make yourself, into a slave of this particular hierarchy that's essentially the only one provided. I don't know, it's in a way, I feel like maybe a solution would be for people to, get woke on the fact that, this is, the Moloch hierarchy might not be as sexy as it's presented. And that, we might be missing something, I don't even know if to call it a spiritual level. I'm not
Yeah.
a very religious person, but, there's something more to life. And I feel like that's a very fruitful avenue that we probably should explore a bit more in our
Yes.
discourse, and how we relate to each other.
Yes, I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Before I let you go, because I know we're going on a little bit over time here, so I hope I'm not keeping you.
No worries. No worries.
So I have a question of the show. Do you have a subversive thinker or writer or someone who's been influential in your life that,
Yeah.
yeah, you think
Okay, so
deserves a
I
bit
came up
more?
I
Sure.
knew this was coming, so I came up with 4. And I will
Perfect.
list them, and I will tell you for each one what exactly they're subversive of. And some of these are a bit unorthodox, but I think they work. So the first 2 are going to be basically analytic philosophers who I think are actually very much worth reading. The first is Derek Parfit. And what I would say he is subversive of is the liberal concept of personal identity and the self. You mentioned earlier that there's kind of this, unbearable burden of the self, especially in the digital age. Well, Parfit's whole philosophical project is showing how the self is not a particularly coherent notion, and how personal identity over time is often indeterminate. And he's associated more with a kind of utilitarian tradition that I think is in our discourse coded as more left-wing or neoliberal. But I actually think that when you look at his arguments, they justify, they can lead to a kind of almost, maybe chic Buddhism or whatever, but they can also lead to, I think, a pretty serious critique of the whole concept of identity, and of like the self being something you need to search, for meaning. I think he destabilizes the whole concept with a variety of very rigorous analytical arguments. He also has a lot of interesting stuff about population ethics, and that's actually another thing he's subversive of. This whole meme that like, oh, we need to stop having kids because climate change, blah blah blah. As I read him, he presents an extremely powerful challenge to that view by basically showing how it's actually very hard to avoid the conclusion that a world with many more people, all at fairly low levels of welfare, would be better than a world with fewer people at higher levels of welfare. I mean, it's partly based on this kind of just weird, crude additive utilitarianism, but he like constructs these very clever arguments for this conclusion. Your readers can look up the Repugnant Conclusion on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Derek Parfit, Derek Parfit. Look up Derek Parfit and the Repugnant Conclusion and his work on personal identity. It subverts a lot of liberal memes and notions. Second thinker in that vein is a kind of analytic political theorist named G.A. Cohen, who was a hardcore Marxist at Oxford, sometimes referred to as a no bullshit Marxist, because he wasn't into all the kind of postmodern or critical theoretic jargon that a lot of neo-Marxists are into. He was like into analytic philosophy and hardcore econ. And the reason I would recommend reading him, what I think he subverts is the kind of liberal and libertarian idea that that we can draw really principled distinctions between state and corporate power. He shows how the rules of the market economy the state sets up are themselves a power structure that can restrict freedom in all kinds of ways. I think he has an essay called is money freedom, or does money restrict freedom? And it's basically, his point is just like, to have money or to have property is to deny everyone else access to it, and thus, all kind of private property is itself restricts other people's freedom. And he makes all sorts of analytical arguments against Robert Nozick, famous libertarian, contributed a lot to debates about, quote unquote, the equality of what debate, what we ought to be equalizing. And look, he's a Marxist, so like a lot of his actual proposals are insane and wouldn't work. But he is very good at, I think, sort of destroying a lot of the stupid brainworms libertarianism that is woven into our culture. And I would recommend conservatives read him, because I think that, frankly, if you will come away from him really realizing how just intellectually impoverished a lot of libertarian economic arguments are, and how they just ignore all sorts of very important philosophical dimensions and objections. And then, so the second two that I'll recommend are both, in their own ways, works of history and arguably applied sociology. Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher, which talks about the kind of cultural the four sort of folkways from Britain that came over from the UK to the United States and helped settle the colonies. What that subverts really is the kind of idea that we're a purely credal nation. I don't think that it shows that credalism is unimportant, and in fact, it arguably provides a kind of cultural genealogy for the sort of universalist credalism that a lot of Americans believe in. But it does a very good job of showing how that universalist notion is itself rooted in a very particular strain of Protestant culture that is not necessarily itself universal. And it really does a good job of showing how just like a lot of conflicts and ideas in the United States today really can be traced back to like these, four Puritan folkways. It's also just an entertaining book. It's 1,000 pages, which scares people, but it's really engagingly written. You can get through it surprisingly quickly. Highly recommend.
Yeah.
And the last,
I've had it on Audible. It's pretty easy to consume that way, just in case people.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah.
And the last one I would say, more recent, is Hugh Davis Graham. He has a book called Collision Course, which is on the interplay of civil rights and affirmative action policy, or really affirmative action and immigration. But it's really like a history of kind of how the civil rights state interacted with immigration and how that kind of helped create a lot of these like new legal racial fictions and categories like AAPI. I mean, he talks about that. He talks a lot about the history. And a lot of what he ends up showing is how both immigration influenced these categorizations, but also how it kind of obsolesced them, and how, like it presented a kind of long-term challenge to affirmative action because it destabilized the racial categories on which affirmative action policy was built. I think there's just a lot of good history in there, and most straightforwardly, it's subversive of a lot of the kind of woke narrative about both affirmative action and immigration, and shows how just path dependent and arbitrary it was. Also, I think there's a certain way where you can read his ideas as like almost a maybe left wing, not critique of immigration, but like a cautionary note that it's very hard to kind of have affirmative action policies that deliberately try to like socially engineer society while you are simultaneously changing the underlying like composition of society. Like it's easy if everything is standing still and in stasis to kind of move the pieces around and engineer it. It's a lot harder when it's constantly in flux, and that's really what immigration does. I also think there's a way of reading it that maybe is subversive of some right-wing pessimism about immigration, because it, I think, shows how immigration actually in the long run can destabilize some of the woke concepts and categorizations into which, politicians attempt to enlist immigrants. And like, I think Ross Douthat had a column about this, but the racial future of the United States is, I think, more indeterminate than people realize, and that's actually, in some ways, I think probably a good thing that may augur well in the long run for, the possibility of kind of breaking out of some of these like, weird racial binaries we have that kind of are constitutive of a lot of the kind of woke political and moral narrative. So yeah, those are my 4.
Yeah, those are really good ones. I've read some Derek Parfit, and I've read the Albion Seed, but I haven't read the other 2. So I'll definitely check those out.
Check out. It's called I think it's called self-ownership, freedom, and equality, or something like that. That's the Cohen book that I think is like the most just utterly devastating critique of libertarianism. It also actually contains an interesting critique of the concept of self-ownership, which is also, I think, subversive of a lot of like liberal Lockean notions, not just in economics, but in the culture writ large. So that's another reason to read it.
Nice, good. I'll add it to my post-liberal reading list.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Marxists and a lot of Marxists to be honest on there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it tends to be it. I want to thank you so much for coming on. You're doing a heck of a job. Like your writings is sterling, and just the way you present arguments is, second to none. So I thank you a lot for doing this job and for thinking through these problems in a really original way. And I want to point people towards your work. Like where can people find you? What's the best?
So I'm on Twitter at Aaron. Just the handle is at Aaron Sibarium, all lowercase. The last name is spelled Sibarium. And I am now a writer at the Free Beacon. So, my reporting, which is more kind of analytical reporting, I try to like unpack sort of some of the, deeper stories and causal mechanisms behind like the surface level outrages. You can read all that at the Free Beacon. I haven't written any essays in a few months because I've been busy with work, but I do plan to get back to freelancing at some point soon. And I've written for a place called American Purpose, American Compass, to a lot of Americans, and bit for Quillette and National Review. But yeah, you can find my work on Twitter.
Cool. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really fun.